January the 17th, 1945. The frozen air cuts like razors across the snow-blanketed plains of eastern Kansas. In a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by double rows of barbed wire, 53 men sit in darkness, not because the lights have failed, but because their eyes no longer see. They are German prisoners of war blinded by wounds taken in the Ardennes, in Normandy, across the bleeding fields of France. Some lost their sight to shrapnel at Bastogne, others to phosphorus burns in the Hurtgen forest, a few to infections that festered for weeks in field hospitals before American medics loaded them onto trains bound for the American heartland. They sit now in silence, hands trembling not from cold alone, but from something deeper, an animal terror that whispers in the dark corners of defeated minds. They have been told they are going to a special facility. They do not know what that means. In the Germany they left behind, the word special carried implications measured in chimney smoke and unmarked graves. The wind howls through gaps in the barrack walls, and someone near the stove begins to weep. No one comforts him. Each man is alone in his private night, wrapped in the particular horror of helplessness in enemy hands. They remember the propaganda films shown in Wehrmacht barracks before the war, grainy footage of American gangsters, of bread lines during the Depression, of a nation supposedly weak and mongrelized and incapable of mercy. They remember the directives issued by officers in 1944 when defeat became inevitable. The Americans take no prisoners. The Americans experiment on captives. Surrender means death by slow degrees. And now here they are, blind and broken, waiting for whatever comes next. Outside, boots crunch on frozen ground. The door opens, cold air floods in, and with it, voices speaking English in soft Midwestern accents. Hands, gentle, careful hands, reach out in the darkness. This moment, repeated in variations across dozens of prisoner of war camps throughout America between 1943 and 1946, represents one of history's quiet miracles, the collision between totalitarian expectation and democratic reality. The German soldiers who surrendered to American forces carried with them not just weapons and field gear, but an entire architecture of assumptions about how enemies treat the vanquished. They had been raised in a system that valued strength above compassion, that saw mercy as weakness, that treated human life as currency to be spent or saved according to ideological calculation. The Third Reich's own treatment of prisoners, particularly Soviet POWs, 3 million of whom died in German captivity, had established a baseline of brutality that informed every German soldier's understanding of what capture meant. To be taken prisoner was to be erased, to become disposable. To be wounded and captured was worse. To be blinded and captured seemed to them a fate equivalent to being buried alive. But the men who arrived at the Kansas camp in January 1945 and at similar facilities in Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Virginia discovered something that undermined every certainty they had carried across the Atlantic. They discovered that the Americans had built specialized hospitals for blind prisoners of war, not camps, but hospitals, that doctors trained at Harvard and Johns Hopkins had volunteered to treat enemy soldiers with the same protocols used for American servicemen, that occupational therapists were teaching Braille to Wehrmacht veterans, that prosthetic specialists were fitting glass eyes to SS officers, that the United States government, in the midst of total war, had allocated resources to ensure that men who had recently been trying to kill American soldiers would not spend the rest of their lives in helpless darkness. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. It was, for many of these men, the first crack in the ideological foundation upon which their entire adult lives had been constructed. The transition was not immediate. Trust, once shattered, rebuilds slowly. In the early weeks, the blinded Germans resisted. They refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. They rejected physical contact, certain that any touch presaged violence. They communicated in whispers, using code phrases to warn each other of imagined threats. American medical staff, many of whom had treated wounded soldiers just returned from European battlefields, found themselves employing techniques more appropriate to traumatized children than to combat veterans. They spoke constantly as they worked, narrating every action. "I'm going to touch your arm now. I'm bringing you water. I'm adjusting your blanket," until gradually, incrementally, the Germans began to understand that the narration was not mockery, but kindness, a way of restoring agency to men robbed of sight. The food became the first bridge. Each meal arrived with abundance incomprehensible to men accustomed to Wehrmacht rations that had diminished to near starvation levels by 1944. Fresh bread, not the sawdust extended Kriegsbrot of late-war Germany, but actual wheat bread, soft and warm, butter, not margarine, real coffee, not roasted acorns, meat portions that would have fed 3 soldiers in the Afrika Korps, fruit that many of them had not tasted in years. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria who had lost his eyes to a grenade at Aachen, later wrote in his memoir that he wept the first time he tasted an orange, not from gratitude, but from rage, because it proved that everything he had been told about American weakness and poverty had been a lie. If the enemy could feed prisoners like this, what did that say about the cause for which he had sacrificed his sight? The medical care followed a similar pattern of disorienting generosity. American ophthalmologists performed reconstructive surgeries on men whose injuries German doctors had declared untreatable. They fitted prosthetics with care that exceeded what many German soldiers had received when they still wore the uniform. They administered penicillin, still scarce in civilian America, to prevent infections. They brought in occupational therapists who taught mobility techniques, who trained fingers to read Braille, who patiently guided hands across raised maps until mental cartographies reformed in minds that had known only darkness. The International Red Cross inspectors who visited these facilities in 1945 reported conditions that met or exceeded the standards of American military hospitals. German prisoners received the same quality of care as American soldiers, sometimes in the same facilities, treated by the same doctors. This was not propaganda, this was policy, enacted at a cost measured in millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours, resources diverted from the war effort to ensure that defeated enemies would not be abandoned to their wounds. And slowly, reluctantly, the mental walls began to crumble. The transformation happened in small moments, repeated daily across the mundane terrain of rehabilitation. A nurse named Dorothy, a farm girl from Illinois, who spent hours each day reading letters aloud to men who could no longer see their own mail. She read without judgment, letters from German wives, from mothers, from children, her voice steady and warm, treating these words from the enemy homeland with the same respect she would have accorded American correspondents. A physical therapist named James, who had lost his own brother at Omaha Beach, who nevertheless guided a former Wehrmacht sergeant through the painful process of learning to walk without sight, his hands firm on the German's shoulders, his voice patient through setback after setback. An orderly named Thomas, himself a conscientious objector, who had chosen medical service over combat, who sat with a sobbing Luftwaffe pilot every night for 2 weeks, saying nothing, just present in the darkness until the man's terror subsided enough to sleep. These were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were ordinary Americans, many of them ambivalent about showing kindness to men who had served Hitler, who had participated in a war that had killed hundreds of thousands of their countrymen. But they had been raised in a culture that valued certain principles over personal vengeance. The idea that human dignity transcended nationality, that compassion was not weakness but strength, that the true measure of a society revealed itself not in how it treated allies, but in how it treated enemies. They enacted these principles not through grand gestures, but through the grinding dailiness of care, changing bandages, guiding hands to forks, describing the world to men who could no longer see it, holding the hands of frightened men through long winter nights when memory and darkness conspired to convince them they had been forgotten. The symbolic weight of that gesture, the American hand, extended to the German hand, carried meanings that transcended the individual moment. In the tactile vocabulary of touch, in the physical connection between victor and vanquished, something fundamental was communicated that no amount of propaganda could have conveyed. The German soldiers had been taught that democracy was weak, that pluralism bred decadence, that only the iron discipline of totalitarianism could create a strong society. But here, in the daily reality of the POW hospitals, they encountered a different kind of strength, the strength required to show mercy when vengeance would have been easier, the strength to uphold principles when expedience beckoned, the strength to treat enemies as human beings when ideology demanded their dehumanization. By spring of 1945, the character of the camps had shifted. The blinded Germans no longer whispered in code. They called nurses by name. They joked with orderlies. They gathered in common rooms to listen to radio broadcasts, news of Germany's collapse delivered in English they were learning to understand. Some wept at the reports from liberated concentration camps, confronted for the first time with the full reality of what had been done in their nation's name. Others retreated into denial, unable to reconcile the regime they had served with the horrors now documented in American newspapers. But all of them, even the most recalcitrant, had been changed by the months of care, by the accumulation of small kindnesses, by the undeniable evidence that they had been treated with a humanity their own government had never extended to its enemies. The records are extensive. The International Red Cross maintained detailed logs. The U.S. Army Medical Corps documented procedures and outcomes. Individual testimonies, memoirs written decades later by former POWs, oral histories collected by German universities, letters preserved in archives, all tell variations of the same story. They speak of expectations shattered, of ideologies undermined not through argument but through experience, of men who arrived broken and terrified and who left, if not whole, then at least convinced that the democratic principles they had been taught to despise contained something their own system had fundamentally lacked. A former SS officer interviewed in the 1970s described his time in the American POW hospital as the education my university never provided. A Wehrmacht corporal wrote in his memoir that he learned more about freedom in 6 months of American captivity than in 12 years of Nazi schooling. This is not to romanticize the experience. These men remained prisoners. They had been defeated in a war they had helped wage, a war of conquest and genocide that had devastated a continent. Many carried guilt they would never fully process. Some remained committed Nazis until death. The point is not that American kindness transformed every German POW into a Democrat. It did not. The point is that in treating enemy prisoners with dignity, in upholding Geneva Convention standards even when the enemy had violated them repeatedly, in allocating scarce resources to the care of men who had recently been combatants, the United States demonstrated the practical application of its stated values. And that demonstration, witnessed by thousands of German soldiers who returned home after the war, planted seeds that would influence the reconstruction of German democracy in ways both subtle and profound. The winter of 1945 passed. Snow melted into mud, mud into the green abundance of American spring. In the POW camps, blinded Germans sat in sunlight they could feel but not see, faces turned toward a warmth they had not expected to experience again. Some had been fitted with prosthetic eyes, carefully crafted by American technicians who treated each piece as if it mattered, as if restoring the appearance of wholeness to a defeated enemy was worth the time and skill required. Others had begun to learn trades they could practice without sight: leatherwork, basket weaving, simple carpentry. American instructors worked alongside them, hands guiding hands, teaching skills that might provide livelihood when these men eventually returned to a Germany that existed now only as rubble and memory. And through it all, that gesture repeated, the American hand extended, the German hand grasping it, the human connection that defied ideology and transcended enmity. In the tactile language of touch, in the patient guidance through darkness, in the simple act of holding on through fear and uncertainty, something elemental was communicated, a message about what kind of society had the strength to show mercy, about what freedom actually meant when tested against the crucible of total war. By the time the first groups of blinded POWs were repatriated in late 1945 and throughout 1946, they carried with them more than memories of American abundance. They carried the lived experience of democratic principles in action. They had been shown in the most vulnerable moments of their lives that an enemy did not have to become an executioner, that capture did not require cruelty, that the strong could choose to be gentle without ceasing to be strong. They returned to a Germany that had to rebuild not just its cities, but its entire moral framework, and they brought with them a testimony more powerful than any political speech. They had been blind and helpless in enemy hands, and the enemy had held their hands through winter instead of abandoning them to darkness. This is what democracy looks like when it extends beyond abstraction into action, not perfect, not unmarred by individual failures, but fundamentally committed to the proposition that human dignity transcends nationality, that principles matter more than expedience, that mercy is not weakness but the ultimate expression of strength. In the frozen barracks of Kansas, in the hospital wards of Texas and Tennessee, in the moment when American hands reached out to German hands and held on through the long darkness, something profound was proven about the distance between two kinds of societies, one that valued power above humanity and one that believed humanity was the source of true power. The blinded German soldiers who experienced that difference carried the knowledge home with them, a seed planted in the ruins, a quiet testimony to the proposition that even in war, especially in war, how we treat our enemies defines who we are.